Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 5 cheat sheet. We're looking at some of the changes and impacts from Game Week 4 and the EFL Cup plus Champions League. I'm recording this video right now on the Wednesday morning, so that's after some of the EFL Cup matches were played. We've also seen some of the matches from the Champions League as well, including Aston Villa. However, Arsenal and Man City are yet to play, and we'll also find out some news on some of the teams involved in other European competitions further this week. As far as Game Week 5, if you've never watched the cheat sheet before, it's effectively a series where we look at the players based on their price point and their position, just looking at sort of how effective, how useful they are for the oncoming run of games. Not just the next three fixtures, but just generally speaking in the medium to long term as well, taking that into account. What I would say about a game week like this here in game week 5 is that unfortunately, within the attackers, I do think that the options are actually running very, very thin. I'm not really enthused with too many of the picks. We had some key events like, for example, Eze losing penalties, and that takes away from the value of a lot of players within the game. We're starting to see, for example, the reduction of Liverpool minutes across the board, particularly within the attackers that are not named Salah, and those impacts are now being felt within the cheat sheet. So that's what I would say this week, where I'm not in love with the landscape. Before we jump into the cheat sheet, I'd like to shout out Fantasy Football Hub. Fantasy Football Hub is a fantastic tool to help increase your rank as an FPL manager. If you're actively competing in any mini leagues, I think it's an absolutely wonderful tool. They also have an offer, which is to win your mini league or get your money back. And of course, up until the end of this month, you'll have a 50% offer to get from Fantasy Football Hub and gain access to a lot of the advanced tools and even projected model data as well, which will help you support your FPL run this season. So have a look in the link in bio below. So at 5.0, that sort of price point, Rogers gets a drop. Adama stays where he is. Rogers gets a drop because the minutes have been fantastic so far. But to be fair, someone like Adama has had similar minutes. I know someone would like to mention Onana right now, who's scored in the Champions League, scored twice already. But I have to say that sort of the reproduction of the sort of goal scoring that Amadou Onana has actually gotten so far is a little bit outrageous for a DM. So I'm not really that concerned about Onana as a pick. Ultimately, he also has less minutes than someone like Rogers right now. We've seen early substitutions for someone like Barkley if they need a little bit more sort of direct control of the game and dominance, right? So I think that's something that I would mention is quite interesting. Rogers, though, has still played really good minutes. I don't have waning confidence in him, but the reality is, as the fixtures get slightly worse and worse, and you've overcome more good fixtures, then Rogers, and I'm assuming as well, his minutes will potentially drop because of the sort of strength of Duran as a player as well, right? Duran being so good, in my opinion, still knocks off potentially more attacking positions that are attributed towards the sort of midfielders and wingers of the team. And that's sort of a negative impact that I think Rogers will feel maybe in the short to medium term. So that's why Rodgers gets a drop. In the 5 point sort of 5+ tier, no real changes right now. Semenyo's still at the top, even though the fixture this week is absolutely horrible. This is the type of fixture where you absolutely want to be benching Semenyo if you can. I think that his underlying stats have been so far clear above his peers within this price point that he's very, very interesting still. Ultimately, after game week 5, the fixtures for game week 6 and 7 are really, really good. So there's absolutely no reason to switch off of someone like Semenyo or even change his tier because I think so far he's become a clear talisman of the Bournemouth team. Yes, of course, it's a huge sort of leap in terms of the numbers for 24-25 versus 23-24. But we know that part of that impact is simply because Solanke is gone. And I would say that Evan Nilsson is less of a key impact for the team in the same way that Solanke was. As far as Kevin Schade, yes, of course, the underlying stats are not there yet, but I have to expect when you're projecting someone to play, a very defined position, that he might be the center forward going forwards, just like we saw within the EFL Cup, which I think was a bit of a dress rehearsal. We also saw the sort of 46 minutes of football that he played versus Man City as well. So those kind of things will have impacts on how we sort of foresee Kevin Schade, but I think he's just going to be an amazing pick going forwards if the minutes are even remotely sort of above 75, 80 minutes, simply because Brentford's run of fixtures are that good. Minte gets a drop. Once again, if you sort of overcome one of the best fixtures on your schedule, and that's gone now, it's very likely that you can drop. So that's why Minte is finally getting a drop. On top of that, the minutes he actually played in Game Week 4 were much less than I actually expected. And that's an unfortunate thing. I think, of course, at this sort of price point, you can't be asking for too much. Yes, Smith Rowe has been the only player within this sort of tier who has consistently sort of delivered for most managers who's also been owned. But I would say that Smith Rowe is someone that I see as someone who's a great game ultimately in game week 5, but then probably after that is a little bit of a sell. The reason why for Smith Rowe being a sell is the minutes still aren't amazing. The underlying stats are still good, but not fantastic, particularly when you contextualize that he's actually a more of a 70 to 75-minute player as opposed to a 95-minute player, which a lot of players within this price point are, right? So Menyo's a 95-minute player, Rogers is, McNeil arguably is, and even Sade we could see potentially could even sort of reach those sort of levels very, very shortly. So that's why I'm a little bit lower in Smith Rowe, and that's why I don't really see him as being a green option for now. Burton Diaz is an interesting case where it seems like he might have penalty share. I know Dibbling played really well as well, and some people will want me to have Dibbling on the cheat sheet, but I think it's going to be hard to sort of imply that Dibbling is going to be an amazing asset because he's also got no pen share, and Burton Diaz has a history of building very, very consistent underlying stats. Now he hasn't really done so far within Sheffield, within Southampton. But when you compare to, let's say, someone who's playing at Sheffield United last season, played very, very good minutes, and ultimately was playing for a awful historic attacking team and still built those numbers, I think there's some confidence in Burton Diaz and his ability to sort of perform in a struggling team, and that precedent is there. So that's sort of my thoughts on Burton Diaz still. As far as Tielemans, he's been added to the cheat sheet as a differential. Tielemans is someone who, in my opinion, should be the penalty taker of Aston Villa, given that he actually has a very strong penalty taking record and a very consistent penalty taking record. On top of that, he's someone who's firmly now a much more important player to the team. We saw him get man of the match in the Champions League. He also got 1 goal, 1 assist, but that's not really the point. Yes, his underlying stats are going to be a little bit poor, but he also takes set pieces, which is a huge plus. And on top of that, ultimately, as I said, with the minutes being much better this season and potential penalty taking shouts there, I do think Tielemans is an interesting pick. Sort of reminds me of a little bit like Douglas Luiz last season, if you guys can think about that sort of scenario. Yes, of course, Douglas Luiz was scoring goals from set pieces. Yes, of course, Douglas Luiz was sort of scoring goals from open play, but it's not something that you would have really expected from him. He did overperform quite a lot. I do think Tielemans can sort of provide that sort of value this season if he's the penalty taker. As far as the 6.5 tier, Sobo stays where he is. He finally got his goal within the Champions League. And simply put, with the lack of depth that Liverpool have right now, Sobo is someone who's going to be benefiting for the short term. Him actually sort of hitting that sort of production within the Champions League is a positive for the weekend. Eze losing penalties is very, very, very significant in FPL, but that's more for the long term. I would say for the medium term, the fixtures are still good enough for Eze to be a top pick. And when you contextualize that Eze actually has really good underlying stats compared to most of the players at around this price point, I have to say that there's no real concern from my point to immediately look at Eze as someone like a sell. Yes, of course, pen shares there. He might not be essential on a Game Week 6 wildcard, but that's sort of my thoughts on Eze. I still think he's a top pick. I would definitely not shy away from moving towards Eze because the reality is I could still wildcard into him Game Week 6. It's just that he's no longer someone that I view as being essential now that he's potentially not on pens. Glasner has actually iterated on this situation, but I wasn't really confident about what he said because it really seems the case that Mateta, as long as he has the confidence and is on the pitch to take the penalty, will probably continue to do so and take them away from Eze. Those are my thoughts on Mateta and JP. As far as players like Mitoma, he gets a drop, Kudus gets a rise, and Rashford gets a rise. Now, Rashford gets a rise because I think, once again, sometimes production breeds future minutes as well. Because from a manager's perspective, when you're seeing a player constantly sort of return, I think it's very hard to sort of put him on the bench, that sort of thing. Rashford getting good minutes, getting good production is something that actually reinforces, in my opinion, his medium to long term minutes. And so that's why Rashford gets a rise. As far as Kudus, he's been playing so well too that I think that you've seen this sort of same situation prop up for West Ham, where he's played a lot of minutes so far. Somerville has barely contested the minutes from Kudus, and actually instead, you're seeing Somerville sub on for other players. So I think the benefit here with West Ham getting better games is that Kudus definitely gets a rise. Mitoma gets a fall though, because of course you're coming off of the Ipswich at home fixture. And ultimately, as I said, his open play stats in the past have never been that stellar. He's obviously a class player, but he doesn't have set pieces. He doesn't have penalties. And so when the fixtures get a little bit more rough for Brighton, I do think Mitoma is someone who definitely deserves a fall. And, once again, coming off the best fixture, that does have impacts. Madueke gets a fall for a similar reason, but it's actually more so due to minutes as opposed to the fixtures getting worse for Chelsea. You've come off some good fixtures for Chelsea, some poor ones as well. I just think that Madueke is clearly going to struggle to maintain his spot in the team. Yes, the hat trick is something that happened quite recently, but just with the amount of bodies available, with Sancho playing so well too in the left wing position, it's possible that we could actually see subs like Neto on the right wing position. And then that can have knock on impacts on Madueke's minutes, as we're already starting to see him get subbed off for other players. So that's why I think Madueke gets a drop. In the 7.x tier, no real changes other than Bowen getting a rise and the Liverpool midfielders getting a drop. Now, Bowen getting a rise is very similar to the Kudus rise. It's simply a better run of games for West Ham. Bowen has already been producing this season and he's looked incredible. As far as Jota and Diaz, we're starting to see the impacts take a huge sort of dent into the expectations of these midfielders. On top of that, I'll say that the rise of Gakpo and actually the lack of threat of Darwin has made things a little bit easier for these players. But the reality is, it's going to be very hard to sort of pick which player is going to be missing out going forwards, because I think we can continue to see things like Gakpo and Jota start. But what if we could also see Gakpo and maybe Luis Diaz start as well? I think that would be an interesting sign to see whether that has an impact, because Gakpo is clearly playing well as a substitute or even as a starter for slot. Clearly, Darwin is not, and I can't really see Darwin starting at the weekend, despite him actually being so fresh. But those are my thoughts right now on the Liverpool mids. You're also approaching the end of the fixture run, so every game you go closer towards the end of the run, they just become slightly worse as an asset. As far as some of the other players here, I mean, I'm not going to talk about the Odegaard injury. I'll wait for Arteta to give us potential news on that, but I doubt that that's going to happen. As far as Foden, he gets a rise. Son gets a rise as well. Foden gets a rise because I just think that his minutes will be very, very good in the medium term. I would not advise buying Foden this week, but I think it's just to sort of level set Foden right now for the medium to long term, right? He's going to be an amazing player. Pep has already mentioned that he sees him more as a central player, and that unfortunately is going to have a knock on impact on someone like KDB as well. So I think there is a small concern that KDB will lose minutes going forwards, particularly now that you're, thoroughly engrossed in multiple competitions at a time. Players like Gundo will also cover minutes. Players like Bernardo will also cover minutes. And so we'll see what happens. But I think Foden really needs to sort of fight back for his spot as a sort of central player. But I'm sure that will happen in due time. As far as Son, amazing fixture here with Brentford at home. And generally speaking, once you come off an Arsenal fixture, the fixture run in general just looks much better. So that's why Son gets a rise. In the forward position FPL, we've had a couple changes. Calvert-Lewin gets a rise. And I just want to mention that Sean Dyche did actually say that there were some illness in sort of issues, and EFL Cup wise, we didn't see Calvert-Lewin start. He wasn't in the squad either. So it might be the case that he's ill, but I doubt that he's going to miss out on the weekend. We'll find out more, and that's why I would suggest for any manager looking at Calvert-Lewin, whilst he does look like the most interesting pick in the sort of 5.x price point right now, do have a look and pay attention to the potential press conference news that you could get from the manager. As far as Welbeck and Vardy, with Welbeck, I would say, look, he definitely gets a drop because, once again, similar to why Matoma's dropped, why Minte's dropped, the fixture run is getting slightly worse. Brighton will sort of be hit with a wall of poor fixtures. Why João Pedro hasn't dropped, though, is simply because I put 3 asterisks around him. If he's available and fit this weekend, I think he's a green pick. If he's not available, clearly, of course, he gets a drop, and you guys know that. But with Welbeck, his sort of value within the game is in a sense tied to João Pedro, but also more so tied towards the fixture run of Brighton, because I think I generally just rate a penalty taker a lot more than someone like Welbeck, who's going to be a situational penalty taker, where when João Pedro's not on the pitch, he can take penalties. When, let's say, Evan Ferguson isn't fit, he can take more minutes with the center forward position. Whereas I think when players like Evan Ferguson get more match fit, when João Pedro is fully fit, Welbeck's minutes will continue to get worse, and that's why he gets a small drop. As far as Vardy, though, he gets a rise, and I think it's very similar to Calvert-Lewin, where generally speaking, the run of games for Everton and Leicester within the medium term are really, really good. And here, Vardy actually becomes probably the best pick of the bunch within this week, with exception to maybe Welbeck, as someone who can play 90 minutes potentially. My concern with Vardy at the start of the season was whether he could actually maintain more than 70, 75 minutes a game. And he actually has over the last 2 weeks, right? He's played 90 minutes each. Edouard is in the team, and Edouard can definitely contest the minutes, but I do think that we're starting to see Vardy is capable to sort of meeting that demand, like he has many times before, but clearly at a much more older age, and so that's why it's really impressive what Vardy is doing. But I think he's going to be a very good short-term pick for a lot of managers, and a very good one-game week punt as well for people looking to shop Isak out. As far as the next tier here, I'm starting to get very, very bored really with the 6.x players within the forward pool. I think it's very, very shallow, unfortunately. We're looking at Duran. He's actually just an incredible player. I think we just have to say that. But the question is always going to be about minutes for me because yes, he's been scoring ridiculous amount of goals coming off as a super sub, but how long can that last and how long will it take for someone like Emery to sort of maybe start playing Aston Villa as a two up top formation? Because I think Duran is incredible. And I really eagerly look forward to a situation where he continues to be a starter of the team if that ever happens. But he gets an introduction just because of the ridiculous sort of presence that he's had. Ridiculous goal in game week 4. We also saw a ridiculous disallowed goal in game week 5. Sorry, not game week 5, but actually within the Champions League. And so I just think Duran, just to give his respects to him, I'm going to put him on the cheat sheet. It seems like Watkins is actually fine based on Emery's quotes. I don't think that Duran's nailed to start or something like that. But the question is always going to be how soon do Aston Villa become a team that actually play two up top to accommodate how good Duran is as a player and whether the team can actually fit around that sort of structure and mold. I'm not sure if that's the case because players like Ramsey as well are playing well, and clearly Emery has a preference for playing Rodgers too. But we'll have a look at that in the short term. Evan Nilsson gets a drop because I think there's a small pen share drop whenever you actually miss a penalty like that. As far as Cunha, he gets a drop because I think I definitely misjudged the run of games for Wolves and probably preemptively made him a yellow pick too early, even though he's a penalty taker, someone who actually has a lot of value and really good underlying stats. So that's why, sorry, Cunha gets a drop again until Wolves get a better run of games. Mateta and Solanke get rises. Mateta for the pen share, a huge increase in terms of my valuation for him as an FPL asset. As far as Solanke, look, he's playing really consistent minutes. He's back fit, and ultimately the Arsenal game is gone. I imagine that he'll finally get to sort of producing for the Spurs team very, very shortly. As far as the other picks, Isak gets a fall, and that's simply because of the sort of doubt over the injury. But generally speaking, of course, Newcastle haven't been playing really well, and Isak is unfortunately a part of that problem. On top of that, too, simply the run of games is coming towards an end. We know Man City at game week 6 is very, very close to closing in now, and so those are the strokes. As far as the defense, not too many changes this week. I would say Leaf Davis gets a huge rise. And part of that is because the run of games is great. The underlying stats remain still very, very strong within the Premier League. A lot of the open play numbers are very, very impressive as well in terms of, how attacking he is as a player. So I think he definitely deserves a rise. Once again, I will have to mention that all the 4.5 players within this cheat sheet are mostly here because I consider them as part of a rotation pairing. So I'm not saying that, by simply playing a bunch of 4.5 defenders, you're going to create an elite FPL team. Absolutely not. I usually see 4.5 players as your third defender, your fourth defender at times. If you're loaded up with purely 4.5s, I don't think that's going to match up to the value of having some of the better fullbacks within the game, some of the better defenders within the game playing for better defenses. So that's just a prefacing point. And the same applies for the 4.0s, right? I don't see any 4.0 as a constant starter. They're amazing in terms of their price point because, of course, sometimes you want to hold a defender as your fifth defender, and that's fine if you want to do so with a 4.0. So that's sort of why I'm giving credence to those players as well. My favorite pick in the 4.0s is still Mosquera. At 4.5, though, as I said, Davis gets a rise. No real changes to players like Lewis either, because I think Lewis actually is still very clearly an important player to the team. Him playing 45 minutes, coming on as a left back, whilst allowing a lot of the other players who've barely played any football so far to actually get a little bit of match action was very clear. We'll see what happens with the Champions League, but I find that players like Guardiola and Lewis can continue to start for Man City going forwards, and that's going to be normal. As far as Oli Aina, he gets a sort of reintroduction to the cheat sheet. Ultimately, I was waiting to see whether he would continue to play within the right back position, with Alex Moreno, coming back into the team as the left back, and he has. And honestly, Nottingham Forest have looked like such an incredible defense, and that's why we have Oli Aina here. I will continue to monitor a team like Nottingham Forest. I do think that right now they're playing at a level of defense where I don't think it's really sustainable for their team, but clearly Nuno is doing something right, and I have to give respect to that. With Guehi, he gets a fall with the sort of Leicester at home games coming to pass. Van de Ven, Dean get rises. Van de Ven coming off an Arsenal fixture, and that sort of injury doubt is great. Dean, ultimately, the minutes have been really good, and he's been playing really well. Once again, I'm still concerned about sort of him being on the edge of those sort of early substitutions with Madsen and what the knock-on impacts of that will be. So we'll have to continue monitoring that. And I do think if you go for Dean, you are sort of playing on that knife's edge. I hope it works out for you as it has so far. As far as Pinnock, he gets a rise, or rather an introduction to the cheat sheet, because Brentford's run of games are closely becoming very, very elite. And you'll see another rise for Pinnock, no doubt, next week. As far as Robinson, he gets the drop because I think Fulham's games are getting worse and worse. And that's sort of symptomatic of what I said last week, where Robinson is definitely a pick that I think is declining in terms of, the need to hold him as an asset. As far as Udogi, Konate, these players, they get rises too. Spurs have a much better fixture run. Konate is just playing really, really well. One of Konate's issues traditionally has been his injury proneness. He might actually finally, for the first time in a long time, play 3 games in a game week. And that's going to have a huge plus, right, for someone like Konate as a FPL pick. So if he can actually make it towards this weekend, then he's actually going to be a steal for the rest of the season, potentially, if he continues to start as he does and stay fit. Um, as far as Munoz, Dalot, no changes there. Same with the sort of tiers below. I haven't actually made any changes really towards some of the elite defenses and elite defenders because I think, yes, of course, Guardiola was actually coming off the bench. That's a significant impact. Simicast got an assist in the Champions League, but also probably was at fault for one of the goals. I see Robertson still starting this weekend, though. And I think, generally speaking, we're starting to see maybe Robertson as a potential drop in the future, maybe if Simicast plays well. But for the time being, I'm very happy with sort of my allocation of the sort of premium defenders, and that's going to stay exactly as it is. As far as the goalkeepers, we have Kepa joining the cheat sheet here. I know a lot of people don't love Kepa, but simply put, Bournemouth defender, a goalkeeper at that sort of price point, that's very strong still. They have a good run of games coming up. Verbruggen and Flicken are still my favorite goalkeepers. Sells had a 9-pointer, Sanchez at a 15-pointer. Do we overreact to that? I don't think so necessarily. Henderson does get a drop because, of course, you're coming off the Leicester at home fixture. And this sort of applies to Leno as well, who's sort of closing into a worse run of games. Same with Allison Becker. But generally speaking, with goalkeepers, I have to say that they're probably the most erratic position in FPL because what I would say is that a lot of actions that you can actually commit as a goalkeeper can be sort of conducive to future points, right? Like, for example, Sanchez made a huge mistake conceding the penalty, then saves it. That's a very, very unlikely scenario where I would say if you replay that many, many times, Chelsea are more likely to be a goal down and Sanchez has made a huge mistake as opposed to Sanchez has saved the day because of a mistake he created, and therefore he gets 15 points. With Sells, clearly Liverpool were not on it that day. That's not to say that I'm not giving credit to Nottingham Forest. I think Nottingham Forest, as I said, have looked incredible so far in defense, like an absolute brick wall. But you still have to give the context that ultimately their run of games is slightly worse than it was at the start of the season, which is why Sells has dropped where he is. And I will continue to monitor, of course, how good a team like Nottingham Forest are, and probably Sells will maybe rise towards the top if we're starting to see that the underlying stats are just continuously great. Because we're only 4 game weeks in. That's only 4 game weeks of information. You can only build upon that, and you don't need to restrict yourself to that 4 game weeks of information when you have, effectively a sea of history of watching Nottingham Forest play as well in the prior season. Clearly, they've made a lot of defensive impacts like Milenkovic as well. But that's the cheat sheet for Game Week 5. I hope you guys have a wonderful time. Take care and goodbye, and I'll see you guys soon.